As just introduced, I'm Yoshiaki Terumichi, President of Sophia University. Your Excellency, Mr. António Guterres, Secretary-General of the United Nations, welcome to Japan, to Tokyo, and to Sophia University. It is a profound honor and pleasure for us at Sophia University to welcome you today. I can feel a great amount of excitement among the young people seated here today, eager to receive your message in person. Today, we are faced with many global challenges, including poverty, educational issues, environmental issues, emerging conflict between globalism and populism, and complex international relations. In addition, given the diffusion of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things, as well as the utilization of big data, it has become difficult for us to foresee the near future. We will need to foster new ethics for future society. This process will most importantly involve human dignity and human security perspectives. I am convinced that your message on human security will provide us with insight on how we should envision our future. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be grateful for this valuable opportunity, and having shared these moments in this hall, let us, in turn, communicate to society the important message that we are about to hear from the United Nations Secretary-General. I will close my words of greeting by expressing my cordial gratitude to His Excellency, Mr. António Guterres, for granting us his time, and my hope that this will become an opportunity for all of us here to embrace human wisdom. Lastly, I would like to thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs and United Nations Information Center for their cooperation and support. Thank you very much.
It's a great honor to introduce Mr. António Guterres, UN Secretary-General. As a Japanese expert who keeps conducting field research on peace process in South Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and East Timor, I have a huge respect for Mr. Guterres, who has devoted his career to supporting the most vulnerable people in conflict state for decades. For instance, he served as the Prime Minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002, and during that period, he was passionately involved in the international effort to resolve the crisis in the East Timor. He also served as a UN High Commissioner for Refugees from 2005 to 2015 and led UNHCR in tackling one of the most serious refugee crises in the history of humankind. Mr. Guterres was appointed as the 9th Secretary General by UN General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council in October 2016. I would like to emphasize that in the selection process of the Secretary General last year, UN General Assembly hosted a series of informal dialogue in which each of the 13 candidates presented their vision and idea to all UN member states, and they responded to the questions. It was the first time in the history of the UN to create these opportunities. And many experts argue that after Mr. Guterres presented his visions and ideas of actions, the overwhelming majority of member states, including the member of the Security Council, decided to support Mr. Guterres. Megan Robert at the Council for Foreign Relations wrote, quote, "These reforms fundamentally changes the CSG selection process and gave Guterres the chance to emerge as an early frontrunner," quote. After Mr. Guterres took office in January this year, he is passionately advancing his agenda to reform UN organizations. He also continued to stress that conflict prevention is not merely a priority, but the priority. And as Japanese people threatened by the tension of the North Korean nuclear program on a daily basis. Prevention is a core question of human security for not only people in Japan, but also for people in South Korea, North Korea, China, and across the globe. Thus, it's again an extremely honor for us to host his special lecture titled, Global Challenges, the Role of Human Security, in his first visit to Japan as the UN Secretary-General. So, Mr. Secretary-General, welcome to the Sophia University.
Dear friends, all protocol observed, it's an enormous pleasure for me to be here in the Sophia University, one of the most famous university institutions in Japan. And it is also a way to a certain extent, redeem myself from the biggest frustration of my life. We had, as you probably heard of, a democratic revolution in 1974. I was aiming at a university career in my own school, and then with the revolution, with the strong commitment to the political life of my country, I had to close all the books and papers I was working in, and I had to renounce this academic career. So it is always for me a wonderful thing to be able to be back and to face such a wonderful number of students that want to discuss the problems of the future and that want to play a role, hopefully much more successful than my own generation has been playing in today's world. Challenges that we face, and then some words about how human security can be a way to address these challenges in a positive manner. I would start because in today's discussions with your Prime Minister and with the different areas of the Japanese society I had the opportunity to meet, I would start because their concern was very much focused on that with the nuclear threat. We had forgotten about the nuclear threat after the end of the Cold War. For decades we thought this was something of the past. It would not happen again. And all of a sudden we are confronting again the nuclear threat. And I think no other people like the Japanese people can testify the meaning of this terrible threat to our societies. Japan was the country that was victim of the nuclear attack that took place in our history. Now, the truth is that with the North Korea recent development, we are facing the nuclear threat again. And also, if you take into account the complex negotiations that took place in order to have an agreement with Iran, and now the fact that there is a threat that the United States might withdraw from that agreement, there is an effective risk that non-proliferation, something absolutely essential in today's world, that non-proliferation might be at risk. And the idea of a proliferation of nuclear arms is a very dramatic idea, because the more countries have nuclear weapons, the biggest the risk of nuclear weapons to be used, and the biggest risk of nuclear weapons to be all of a sudden coming into the hands of these rogue elements that today we have in the world, and namely terrorist organizations. So, first challenge, we cannot ignore the nuclear threat is back. Second challenge I'd like to draw your attention to, this multiplication of conflicts we are witnessing everywhere, conflicts that seem to have no end, and in which there is more and more a complex interrelation among them and a complex relation of them with the new threat of global terrorism. Terrorism always existed, but terrorism was kind of isolated here and there for different reasons by different actors. Now we have a global threat of terrorism that can strike anywhere. And why are we witnessing this multiplication of new conflicts, and at the same time we are seeing that old conflicts seem never to die? If you look at Somalia or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Afghanistan, it goes on for decades and decades and decades. It doesn't stop. I think that one thing that is clear is that unfortunately power relations in the world became more and more unclear. And as power relations become unclear, I remember when I was a student, we lived in the bipolar world. the rules of the game were clear, even if we did not live in a world that had a global governance system and much less a democratic one. But the rules of the game were relatively clear. The two superpowers would be in control. They would have lots of small wars by proxy, but whenever things would be dangerous, they would intervene and stop it. Then I lived, when I was in government as Prime Minister of Portugal, the period of American supremacy. And again, we had not a global governance democratic system, but the rules of the game were also relatively clear. I, as Prime Minister of Portugal, had to deal with the dramatic crisis in East Timor, where Japan played also a very important positive role. And the truth is that when there was a risk of a massacre in East Timor, the moment in which the President of the United States decided that an intervention was necessary, something that seemed impossible one day before became essential the next day. At the time, again, the rules of the game were clear. There was one superpower, and as I said, it was not a democratic governance system, but there was predictability in the way things would happen. Today, with the less clear power relations, we have unpredictability and impunity a little bit everywhere, and we see those conflicts, as I said, multiplying and never ending. And some of them, as I also noticed, are interrelated. If you look at Nigeria, and then Mali, and then Libya, and Somalia, and Iraq, and Syria, and Yemen, and Afghanistan, all these conflicts are interlinked. We have fighters going from one to another. They are linked, as I also mentioned, with the new threat of global terrorism. And most of them are asymmetric. They are not conflicts between two countries. They are conflicts inside the country, even if they have regional consequences, and more actors around implicated in those. And being asymmetric, they witness also a large number of actors. It's no longer a government against a rebel group, but you have 5, 8, 10 militias, ethnic, religious, political militias. And you have bandits, and sometimes you are a bandit in the morning and a member of a militia in the afternoon. It makes very difficult to find a solution for these conflicts, and even the traditional peacekeeping activities of the UN become very much put at stake. You had just 2 days ago 14 Tanzanian soldiers in the Democratic Republic of Congo, peacekeepers that were there to protect the Congolese people, and they were killed in an attack by one of the militias that were operating in that part of the territory. So, second challenge, unclarity in power relations in the world, leading to impunity and unpredictability, with a multiplication of conflicts being more and more difficult to solve, and international humanitarian law not to be respected, and the suffering of people increasing quite dramatically. Third, I would talk about climate change. We are not only facing a very serious threat, but we are not yet winning the war against climate change. There was a lot of progress. We had the Kyoto Protocol, and Japan must be praised for the leading role that Japan always played in this regard. We had the Paris Agreement on climate change. But unfortunately, the commitments made in Paris are not being fully met, and even if they were met, they are not enough to address the challenge. We have now a concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that is unparalleled since 800,000 years ago. And in 2017, for the first time in the last few years, the emissions of CO2 will increase again. You have seen, and of course, Japan is a country that has suffered a lot with natural disasters of different kinds. We have seen how in this year in the Caribbean we saw a huge multiplication of the number, of the intensity of the hurricanes and the dramatic impacts they had in several of the island states of the region. And this is getting worse and worse. We see natural disasters becoming more intense, more frequent, with more devastating humanitarian consequences. We see drought progressing in several areas of the world, making life impossible in those areas, the Sahel, and then linking drought with conflict and the suffering of people associated to that. We see islands in the Pacific that risk for their future. And as I said, we are not yet winning the war. And we need an enhanced ambition, an enhanced commitment to make sure that we are able to tame climate change, and we have not much time to be able to do it. Then, if one looks at globalization and technological progress, it is clear that globalization and technological progress had a fantastic positive impact in today's world. An enormous growth in wealth, an enormous growth in trade, an improvement of the living conditions of the overwhelming majority of the humanity, a decrease in the absolute number of poor people, absolute poor in the world. We have life expectancies that have also dramatically improved. Infant mortality substantially reduced. So there is obvious a lot of improvements that took place. But at the same time, the levels of inequality in the world have also terribly increased. The 8 richest men, because they are men, there is not any woman in these 8. The 8 richest men in the world have exactly the same level of wealth of the poorest half of humankind. So 8 is exactly the same as more than 3 billion people. And this shows how dramatically inequality has increased among countries, but especially within each country, within each society. And not only inequality has increased with the frustrations, because now everybody knows everything that happens everywhere, with the frustrations and the instability that can be generated, but also you have regions, you have sectors of activity, you have groups of people that were left behind by this wonderful improvement of the global economy that we have witnessed at the same time. We have the rust belts in this world, to just quote an example of the United States of America and its impact on the electoral map of the US. But you have more and more people that feel angry, frustrated, and that translates, that anger and that frustration, in mistrust in relation to political establishments, in mistrust in relation to international organizations. And this is a new factor of instability and potentially a new factor of conflict in different parts of the world. So again, we are facing a number of important challenges from the fact that this globalization is not fair, even if it has produced very important positive developments in the life of so many people around the world. On the other hand, if one looks at technological evolution, and technological evolution has provided enormous benefits to us all, it has with it a number of very important challenges and threats for the future. Look at genetic engineering. Genetic engineering allows us to conceive a world in which a number of diseases can be eliminated. But you can also produce monsters with genetic engineering. Look at artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can improve the living conditions in the world in a fantastic way. But artificial intelligence can also be a double threat. On one hand, a threat to the global labor markets. Imagine a world in which there are no more drivers. In the country where I live now, the United States, the biggest profession, single profession, is drivers. Drivers might disappear in today's world or in next few years' world. And lots of other professions might disappear. We always had, with technological progress during centuries, huge impacts and even huge resistance in societies that were destroying machines. Remember, in the Industrial Revolution, destroying machines to preserve jobs. But the potential impact of technological evolution, of artificial intelligence, of different other areas, the potential impact in labor markets and in the fabrics of societies is huge. And to be honest, there is very little discussion about that and very little preparation made by governments and international organizations to take that into account and to make sure that in the future we will be able to handle these, preventing problems instead of trying to address them when they become too complicated to be solved. And then you have the movements of people, and especially this very substantial increase of the number of irregular migrants and refugees in the world. Now, migration has always been, I know that in Japan, the number of migrants has always been very reduced. But migration has always been in the world a very important factor in relation to the life of countries and in relation to the global development. I would say that migration has been, in large number of circumstances, part of the important solution that countries have had in order to face their own challenges. Now, the problem is not regular migration. Regular migration has been a very important factor of integration of people in labor markets with full rights and contributing to both the economy of the countries of origin and the countries of destination. The problem is that we have more and more people forced to move by conflict, forced to move by climate change, or others forced to move by extreme poverty and do it in an irregular way. And do it in a way that, unfortunately, is causing tremendous suffering, because they are in the hands of smugglers and traffickers that terribly violate their human rights. And we have seen recently the news about people being sold as slaves in Libya. And at the same time, because being irregular, this movement, it triggers sometimes reactions in many societies, in many communities, of rejection of everybody that is different, of everybody that is a foreigner, that has a different religion or a different ethnicity or a different color. I remember when I was High Commissioner for Refugees, the so-called Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. You might have heard of about 1 million people that entered Europe in 2015. Now, the problem was not to have 1 million people in the European Union. In the European Union, there are more than 500 million people, so 1 million would be very easily received. The problem was that all this was done in total chaos. There was no way to organize it, no reception conditions in relation to these people fleeing Syria in the terrible circumstances that were happening in Syria with the war. No way. And so instead of having adequate reception conditions, screening, security screening, guaranteeing that any potential infiltration by terrorist organizations or others would be detected, instead of organizing the reception not only at the first entry, but also then the distribution by all European countries according to the capacity of each one of these countries, which would mean for a country like mine, Portugal, about 30,000 people, very easily to integrate without any problem. What has happened is that there was no reception conditions, there was no division among European countries, there was total chaos, no organization, no cooperation, and then everybody was seeing on television in the evening, every news at 8, a massive movement of people through the Balkans. You might have had some images here, even in Japan, looking like an invasion of Europe. And of course, for people in a village or in a small town, anywhere in Central Europe, they would say, oh, they are coming, and they are coming to me. Well, it was not true. They would not be enough to go to everywhere. But the truth is that the image that was created was that, and this has triggered an enormous reaction of rejection. And that rejection has facilitated the life of radical extreme parties, of populism, of xenophobia, of racism, of different manifestations of irrationality. And as a matter of fact, it has changed the political pattern in many European countries, where you see parties that almost did not exist in the past, emerging as key actors in the political life of those countries based on the rejection of foreigners, based on populist political expressions, and with an influence in their own countries and in the European Union as a whole that could not be imagined. And the same debate in the United States and the same debate in different other parts of the world, even if one looks at the numbers, the majority of the migration movements is from southern countries to southern countries, not from the south to the north. And there are much more Africans moving from an African country to another African country than from Africa to Europe. But that's not the perception that exists. The perception that exists is that all of a sudden all the Africans are moving into Europe, and so Europe needs to close the doors and keep them out. And of course that facilitates, as I said, the expression of the most radical extremist forces in the political spectrum of many developed countries. So we need to have a response to all these threats. And that response needs to be rational, needs to be compassionate, but also needs to be based on an enlightened self-interest, because generosity, as you know, we all know, is a scarce commodity. So it's better to deal with enlightened self-interest instead of just hoping that everybody will become very generous in the future. Now, it's my deep belief that it is an enlightened self-interest of everybody to respond positively to all these challenges. And the key instrument of response to these challenges is to believe that preventing a crisis, preventing a problem, is always much better than managing the crisis, managing the problem. But unfortunately, the prevention capacity in the world is today severely limited. People do not think that prevention is necessary. Prevention is not in the cameras of television. What we see in television is a conflict. It is not something that was prevented and did not degenerate into a conflict. And so there is not enough attention, not enough political attention, not enough budgetary commitment, not enough support in order to make sure that we are able to organize the world with a much stronger commitment to prevention, and at the same time to align two very important agendas that we should have in the international community: an agenda of sustainable development, now that the whole world has agreed on the Agenda 2030, now that the whole world has agreed on the Paris Agreement on climate change, with at the same time an agenda of sustaining peace, allowing countries that have emerged from conflict to be able to address their contradictions in a positive way. And it is in this need to put prevention as a key priority, and in this need to align sustainable and inclusive development with sustaining peace as two essential answers to the challenges we face today, from conflict to climate change to migration movements, to the risks, the potential risks of new technologies and its impact on societies, that I believe the concept of human security is an absolutely crucial concept. If one looks at today's world, the human rights agenda has been losing ground to the national sovereignty agenda. And it's sometimes difficult, even in an organization like the UN, to have a strategy of asserting human rights in different circumstances. I remember that in the 90s, when I was in government, there was this idea of the right of humanitarian intervention, that when a country is not able to protect its citizens, that the international community has a responsibility to do so. And this was the reason that led to the solution of crises like East Timor, or like Bosnia, or like Kosovo. And then this was codified in the General Assembly of the United Nations as the responsibility to protect. The idea that when a country is not able to protect its citizens, there is a responsibility of the international community to do so. But the fact is that these concepts, these ideas, have been put severely into question by this negative evolution that I have translated of the human rights agenda losing ground in relation to the national sovereignty agenda. But paradoxically, the concept of human security has been a concept nobody has been able to put into question. Nobody has considered human security to be an hidden agenda, a pretext for any kind of intervention. Human security based on the dignity of the human being and on the need to make sure that the economic, the social, the political conditions are put together, that we align peace and security with sustainable development, with human rights, in bringing for people the conditions necessary for their dignity to be respected. This concept until now has not been put into question in the political debate, namely in the United Nations. And so we are using more and more human security as a unifying concept for a prevention, sustainable development, and sustaining peace agenda. And we are seeing more and more that the investment that is made in human security, in peace building, in the creation of conditions for resilience of societies, resilience in relation to climate change, resilience in relation to conflict, resilience in relation to poverty, that all these ideas can be put together in a strategy that allows us to have a blueprint for action in support to the international community, and especially in support to the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, to those that this unfair globalization that I mentioned have left behind. Now, Japan has played a very important role. First, the concept of human security was invented in Japan. Second, Japan has been introducing it in international debate and has even created mechanisms to make it operational. There is a fund that Japan has been promoted. There is a number of actions that have been put into place in several parts of the world based on this concept with success. I believe that it is very important for the international community, namely for the UN, to take full profit of the advantages of this concept in order to address the difficulties that we face today in convincing a number of member states to have a positive attitude to an agenda of prevention, to an agenda of sustaining peace, and to an agenda of human rights. And I believe that universities, the civil society, the academia can play a very important role in making sure that this kind of concept plays a growing role in the intellectual discussions, in the way the international community is influenced by thinking, in order to make sure that we are able to move this agenda forward, and that we are able to convince governments in different parts of the world that is in the enlightened self-interest of everybody to have human security as a true priority, both in national strategies and in international relations. Thank you very much.